So no matter whether you choose a library or a framework like this, you have to choose something. And with the jQuery level of things, what we had to avoid was basically having to write a lot of code for just a little effect. Here the problem that we're trying to avoid is quite different. What is it that we're trying to avoid? Well, if we go and look at Knockout and we see what they actually advertise, we can get a feeling for it. It's talking about things like declarative bindings, easily associate DOM elements, blah, 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 and automatic UI refresh. So it's basically talking about how to update the view of your application. And it's hinting about a separation, but that's even more clear if we look at Backbone here, for example. Blah, blah, blah. Yes, they also talk about declarative event handling. And they mention something called models and something called views. And then finally we come to the Angular webpage and they say things like this. It's a great way for declaring static documents. Blah, blah, blah. That's HTML. Angular lets you extend HTML vocabulary for your application. And here, providing an imperative way for manipulating the DOM. Neither of these address the root problem that HTML was not designed for dynamic views. So they all try to solve the same problem here, namely updating your page once you've loaded it. And that seems to be where we are today. You want a dynamic page, something that keeps updating, but as soon as you try to do that with jQuery, you sort of end up in a maintenance nightmare. And let's try this in practice. Let's implement what should be the fundamental hello world application of today's web, namely a like button. So we need a button like this. Let's see if we get a button. Yeah, we do, but it's kind of without any text, like this. Okay, so that seems to work. The button doesn't do anything, and so we need to connect behavior to it somehow. Let's just do a on-click listener here. In fact, let's be a little bit fancier and load in jQuery here. Latest jQuery, nice. And instead of doing that, we just give the button an ID. Sort of like button. There we go. Still works. Still doesn't have any behavior, so let's add some behavior here. And so we need to select on the like button. We need to find it here in the DOM, like button, and then we need to connect the click behavior to it. So we can write on, click, then something should happen. Let's just see that it works first, so we can move on from this part and just do an alert. Say it works. And we run this and try. No one spotted an error yet. I like doing live coding like this because it's like having a pair programming but with 40 people. Like this. It doesn't work. And why not? What are we missing here? Actually, maybe I don't need this one because it's on load. Let's just try this. And it updated. Oh well. Do we have any JavaScript at all? It works. Let's start here. No, okay, so that seems to be the problem. Well, do we have any console here? Let's try this. Console log. Oh, hi. Yeah, that works. How about up here? It works. Right, no. $sign is not defined. Okay, forget about that. Something is busted here. Let's look at another example instead. I have a prepared example. So we want something dynamic in the DOM, right? We want a dynamic page. Here's a page for adding elements. So we have a one element list here. This is the initial element, but it's a dynamic list. And well, we've styled things a bit, but that's just the CSS. The nice thing here is that we've connected this button, and this is how you do it. This is basically what we wrote here, but this time the $sign works. And it says when we click something, then we run a function, and it creates a new list item here. It's a synthetically created DOM element, and it also keeps a running counter here to actually prove that it's dynamic. So it updates the counter as it goes along, and then it just appends it to the end of the dynamic list, right? We can run this, and whenever we press this button, oh, that was weird. I'm probably missing something, some library here. Let's try that again. That would be the simplest explanation, but not. Okay, now it works. Okay, that settles that. Then we can probably implement our like button as well. So we add more elements here, and voila, we have a dynamic page. But even with this small an application, we have sort of maintenance problems. And those maintenance problems will only get larger the larger the page gets. The problem here is basically we're creating our own HTML, and we're doing it inside of the JavaScript code, and we're mixing two concerns. It's not entirely obvious at first that we're mixing two concerns, but we're sort of mixing together the program logic that is really important, and then the view logic, the things that get updated here. And when those two get mixed, it's much, much harder to evolve your application and to upgrade it later. It is kind of easy to go on, and let's restart this one and do prepend to. We can change the logic a little bit like this. Now it inserts in the beginning instead, for example. In fact, now that we have JS Fiddle, let's go back and try this button thing. So we had like this as a button, and our alert now works. We run this. Yay, it works. Okay, fair enough. And then we can actually, inside of a startup block here, we can implement logic for the button. So again, give it an ID, like button. So when we again select on the like button, we find it here, and on a click event it's supposed to run this function, right? It does an alert, and we can do a semicolon there, run this. Thank you. My students on the JavaScript course usually miss that one. Now I did it. Sorry? I'm missing what? Curly brace. Oh no. Where is that? Oh, it's a missing parenthesis, right? On parenthesis click. Right. I probably would have seen that if I had done the console, but I didn't. Okay. Ah, something still doesn't work. Really? Yes, you're right. Like that. Okay. Excellent. Thank you. So one of us found the curly brace and the other found the parenthesis. Again, I wish I could always program like this. So now we actually have behavior for the button. It reacts when we click to it. But we want something like this, right? We want 0 people like this page. and then we want the 0 here to be a bit special, so we give that a span with an ID count, something like this. Right, and if we run this, we see 0 here, but the button still doesn't do the right thing. So it needs to go in and do the right thing here, namely, again, find the current count, which we find if we do select on count and just pull out the HTML from that one. That will be a count, and we can do count plus plus here, and then put it back. So we say again, go to the count span here, and just change the HTML to be, well, I guess the string containing count. So this should update the number here. Let's try that. Yay! So we have a like button. Again, this is probably the fundamental widget of today's web. And there are a lot of things that we ignore here. We ignore, for example, persistence or connection to the server. Usually this would be, you know, a centralized number sitting on someone's server, and we would just mirror it out. But the basic behavior is here, and we nowadays more or less expect a dynamic page to actually update this when we push the button, no matter what happens in the background. Now again, what's the problem with these lines of code? They obviously do what we want. Well, the problem is not so apparent here. It works to program like this, and a lot of people have done a lot of code like this. But when you write a larger application, you simply cannot stay in the DOM like this. Where is this number stored? Well, for a short while we are running this button routine here, it's stored in the variable count. But then this routine exits, and it's no longer stored there. It's only stored in one single place in this application, namely in the DOM. This is sort of is the only 7 that survives between button presses. And that simply doesn't become maintainable after a while. We have a lot of things scattered across the DOM, and we cannot work like that, simply. So we need a model, and we need to make the separation between the model that sort of holds all the data, like this number 7, and the view that presents the data. And why is that separation so important? Well, it's important for evolving the application at all. Right, so 3 reasons to try Angular. The first reason is that in this race between the 7 different frameworks, Angular is clearly out on top right now. They're doing 2 things right at the same time. They're sponsored by Google, and they're open source. Well, all of those frameworks are open source, and that really helps, or it's, let's say it's necessary in sort of the open source landscape that is the web development landscape. So it needs to be open source to succeed in the first place, but then it also needs sufficient backing from someone. It needs sufficient developers, it needs sort of good, stable documentation, it needs someone to upgrade it from version to version. And basically a project like this, and I'm on a couple myself, I know that one of the hardest things to do is to get volunteers for it, to do all, you know, the cage cleaning jobs, the boring jobs. But with this Google backing, you basically have that. You can sort of throw money into maintaining the documentation. So by involving Google, we ensure that Angular has a future in the first place. And if you look at Google Trends, and I'm pretty sure they haven't rigged this, and you search for different frameworks like this, compare Angular to the others, and you see Angular sort of taking off into the skies, and the others are sort of off to a good start, but not at all as impressive. On the other hand, if you do Google Trends with Angular compared to Jquery, I'm not going to show this, but you can try it at home later. Well, Jquery is sort of already miles above Angular. There's simply no comparison. Now, that could simply be because we are sort of earlier in the trend with Angular, but it's also because Jquery is so remarkably established yet. People already know that they should be using Jquery. They haven't decided yet with Angular. But yeah, among the 7 frameworks, well, 7-ish, Angular is currently leading this popularity contest. And then we have this very important reason. It comes in at a second place here. And we can talk a lot about declarative views and so on, and I'm going to show a bunch of examples with freedom from the DOM. Everyone agrees at this point that we need some kind of, well, not necessarily model view controller, but model view something. People sort of disagree about the third part here. And we just can't agree how to do this. And Angular comes out being sort of both helpful at the same time as not sort of getting too much in your way for what you want to do. The most important part it does is it allows you to write pure models. What do we mean by that? Well, basically you can write a small JavaScript application that works standalone without any involvement of HTML or the DOM or anything. You don't have to do any bindings at this point. You just write simple, easy JavaScript objects. So for a like button, for example, we would like an object with an increase method or a like method, something that increases this counter inside of it. And that's it. We can write those without even the browser, actually. We can write them offline, and they will still work. And then you plug them into Angular. And the fact that Angular allows you to do this, sort of write things separately like that, that's a great strength. Then it does another separation as well, and it's fairly alone in this, actually. As you will see in some of the examples here, it allows you to do DOM manipulation in directives themselves. So the code for sort of being all messy with the DOM and so on, it's enclosed in these directives, and then you only use the directives in your HTML. So your HTML comes out as being very pure as well. Compare that to the Jquery that we had here. Here we had all the manipulation, and it sort of, again, it mixes the application code and the DOM code. So let's look at an example of this. Let's look at ngRepeat. Right, AngularJS documentation for ngRepeat, and here as well I need to switch on. I'm a bit paranoid with JavaScript sort of switching on in browsers. We have ngRepeat, and we also have ngClick, which is a bit like the like button that we saw. So what does a like button implementation look like in Angular? Well, we have an ngClick directive here, which allows us to sort of go in and manipulate the model in any way we want. And the example, here you have it. It's basically a like button, and it works. And here's the source code behind that. First, we declare the entire page as an ng application. We can do that for the sort of the top HTML node here, or we can do it further down if only a part of the page is an ng app. We're supposed to have one and only one of these on the page. And this looks like sort of no attribute that you've ever seen before, because it's sort of specific to Angular. And then we have the logic itself, and no JavaScript inside here. We just do ngClick equals count is count plus 1. So where did all the DOM manipulation go? Where did all the sort of funky fetching from the count here, and then incrementing, and then putting back again go? Well, we only have the incrementing left here. And that's what we are left with when you start talking just in terms of the model. We also have to actually initialize the model. So the way this works is that somewhere in memory, and we don't have to care about it too much, we've initialized a variable, or actually a property here, called count. And Angular keeps it for us for as long as we need it. In this case, we only need one. When we're in loops and things, we might need several. And then we simply say, bind this click event for when we want to click the button, just increase this count. And we don't even have any update logic or anything like that. All the DOM manipulation is hidden inside of these directives, so that when we increase the button, when we click the button, it increases the count somewhere in memory, and it also realized that, hey, maybe I need to go and update the view somehow. Let's also look at ngRepeat here. So sooner or later you're going to need a list of things, and the list will be dynamic, right? It's just like the other example we had here of adding things to lists. And here we have a smallish example. Again, we do the initialization here to have some list from the beginning. And then we simply have, you see this is a normal UL list here. And the repeat sits on the li, which means that in our HTML code we only declare one li, and then we say just repeat this one for a particular list. And then the important part here is that this works essentially like a for loop here. We say for this friends variable here, we declare a variable friend that iterates through it. Then we also filter it. We'll see that in the example, but that's less relevant. And then we can simply refer to friend inside here. It starts working like a template here. So we just go into different properties and talk about friend this, friend that, and it simply digs into this data structure, sort of on the go, creating as many list items as needed. Let's see this in action, and let's also see the filter. So this data structure here, pure JavaScript, will get mirrored out as HTML. And all the bindings and everything that's taken care of for us. And just to show off here, they've sort of tied it into a filter as well. So we can dynamically filter on things. If we want to find Mary quickly, for example, we type Mary here, and that's the only one left. And it works in real time. So as we keep deleting things here, that was a bad example. ER, things keep coming and going like that. And they even tied animations into it. And how does that work? Well, the animations are written for us. We just have to add a class here called animateRepeat. If we remove this, the animations go away and it's simply static instead. Here you see a bit of the animation CSS as well. AnimateRepeat is this class here. And yeah, then they have a few transitions going on and so on. So it's mostly no magic at all. Well, the CSS animations aren't anything new with Angular. The magic all happens in sort of doing these bindings, saying that, yeah, simply repeat this list item here for all the elements in this array. And so you end up writing completely declarative HTML here. So all the bothersome details, all the logic that you have to write, they're sort of neatly tucked away into the directives instead. Any questions so far? We'll have a question moment later, but we can take one. Yeah.
In the Jquery example you showed,
right.
You said if we were mixing presentation with logic.
Yep.
Isn't that what we're basically doing here? But instead we're beginning with the presentation and filling it in with logic.
Well, in a way, yes. The really nice win that we've eliminated is these things here, having to sort of worry about details of the DOM. So there are basically two data structures that are involved here. It's the structure of the data itself, which is really simple in this case because we're just holding sort of one scalar value. But then there's the structure of the DOM also. And imagine you go ahead and evolve this application, and a lot of things happen to it, and other developers grab a hold of it as well. Sooner or later, the structure of the DOM will evolve. And when it does, you're basically screwed because you don't know exactly what parts of your application rely on that part of the structure of the DOM being in a certain way. So you get a lot of sort of hidden dependencies between your application and the DOM structure. And that's basically what you get rid of in Angular, because all the time you declare your DOM structure up front, you put these ng repeats inside of the code, and you can sort of freely move around these and without sort of hurting the underlying model. And the underlying model here is completely separate, and if you change that one, well, you do have to go in and change all your ng repeats, but at least it's sort of very well separated, and you can see where you access things. Was that an answer to your question?
Yeah.
Okay, good. And then finally, and this is perhaps one of the more exciting things and one of the things that sets AngularJS apart from the rest of the bunch, Angular is basically aiming towards the same place as HTML5 is aiming. So we have all these cool, nice technologies on the horizon, and AngularJS is taking them into account. Now, of course, there are no guarantees here because these things haven't happened yet. But as far as we can see, AngularJS is a good future investment because these things will happen in HTML5 anyway, and I'll talk a bit about those things. A very strange evolution has followed HTML in recent years. Basically, the people in charge of doing the specifications and everything like that, they wanted to build a big, nice semantic web. So they believed heavily in XML and XHTML and so on. And those streams were basically more and more coming to a halt. I wouldn't say that they're completely gone, but the semantic web has sort of had to leave the center stage for other things. What happens instead is that a bunch of companies said, oh, screw this, we don't want to be part of sort of this evolutionary part. We want to build applications in HTML. We want to build things like Gmail and Google Docs and Twitter and Facebook. How do we do that easily? And the answer for that from the specification guys, from the W3C, was basically, no, it's not an application language, it's a document language. You're supposed to build documents in HTML, not all these fancy dynamic things with things feeling like desktop applications. And the people actually in charge of writing such applications, they said, screw this, we'll just make our own standards. And they formed a group called the WhatWG, sort of in charge of evolving HTML into an application language. And that's what essentially became HTML5 later, and that we're now calling HTML5. Now, HTML5 has an enormously ambitious timeline. People sometimes mention the date 2020 or something like that. Well, some parts of HTML5 you can use already today, and my favorite page for showcasing that is htmlplease.com. Let's see if I have JavaScript turned on for this one. Yep, I do. And here, sort of in a really nice infographic way, you can find out whether your favorite technology is currently supported enough for you to dare to use it in browsers. I really like this one for its presentation abilities. I also use it for sort of making informed decisions when creating web applications. Apparently, we're supposed to avoid box reflection right now, and if we want to read more about that, there's more details here. Often there's links as well. And then sometimes we can use things, but we can use them with caution or with a sort of JavaScript library to fill in the missing details and so on. It's impressive, by the way, how often you can compensate for missing parts of HTML or missing parts of the CSS just with some JavaScript. Basically, that is the saving grace that allows us to pretend that things like Internet Explorer 6 are not there. Or 8 these days, yeah. Internet Explorer 8 is the new Internet Explorer 6. By the way, just as a side note, did you see the campaign that Microsoft has against Internet Explorer 6? IE6 countdown. We're almost done with Internet Explorer 6, by the way. Let's see. I think it's this one. Yeah. Over 10 years ago, a browser was born, and now we want to kill it. It's showing a world map, sort of how far along are we getting rid of Internet Explorer 6. The green countries here are the good ones. They're using very little of it. China is the big sort of bandit here in this gang. I think because of old installs of Microsoft Windows and things like, people simply cannot upgrade. But we're down to, oh, this one says 100%. That sounds really good. But this one is still somewhere between 20 and 30%. Oh, that's horrible. When I last visited this page, it said, I think, 95% or something like that. So according to this one, we basically reached our goal now. And yeah, that feels about right. People are less and less talking about IE6 and more about IE8. Anyway, back to HTML5. So a really long timeline. People are bringing more and more of dynamic behavior and things you need for an application into HTML5, and things that have been sorely missing. And they're doing this sort of without breaking the web. Very important. So take the existing HTML and build backwards compatible features that allow us to do all the things we need. It's everything from smarter form elements that understand email addresses and numbers and URLs and so on, finally, to things like real modules in JavaScript 6. So instead of doing this wonderful anonymous function hack where you put things inside of a pristine workspace where things don't step on each other's toes, you actually will have a module keyword. And that's one of the things that Angular will simply benefit from. Then we also have something called web components, which is meant to solve a number of problems at the same time. For example, it's supposed to introduce templates. So you take a web component and you just fill in the holes that are missing there. That's basically what Angular is doing already. If web components get deployed, then Angular can simply use that technology, and because it will be built into the browser, Angular will simply be faster. So one of these days, sort of some random day in 2016, when you've been using Angular productively for 1.5 years, web components will land in people's browser, and things will just get a nice boost and nice speed up here. There's also other things such as decorators, or allowing people to declare their custom elements, which is also basically what Angular already is doing. When you have these directives, you're basically saying, okay, this is an element that I want to behave in a custom way. And that will also become native inside HTML here. And finally, we have something called the shadow DOM, which allows things to be inside the DOM tree, but still handled as one single element. And that will also lead to a number of improvements. And we will have imports between different documents. And all these will benefit AngularJS as well. The main thing here basically is that they are taking all these technologies into account, and they are basically building Angular in the same way, and to be supportive towards that. If you're interested in more details about that, you can see a presentation called let's see, Future of AngularJS. That sounds about right. Yeah, here it is, Google Drive. By the way, even the logotype here is rather a clever marketing decision. Did you see the logotype for HTML5? 5A. So they're even in the same division like that. Now this is not my presentation, but it basically conveys the message that Angular loves standards as it is. And no other framework is doing this in the same way, sort of trying to align itself to these standards. And you can see here, today we're relying on a number of hacks for supporting modules, for example. We have offline things like require.js and AMD to actually make JavaScript programs or components able to call into each other. We have technologies on top of this like CommonJS and so on, where Node is the big champion, but we also have cool technologies like Browserify, which allows us to write things offline, maybe write a testable application offline, and then simply import it into the browser. It's actually quite cool. But with ECMAScript 6 modules, we can simply do this natively instead, without having all these hacks. So the future of JavaScript is going to look like this. We simply module something, and then we choose what things to export from these modules and what things to keep private. So no more hackish variants like this, where we sort of invent a syntax that Angular has to support. What else? Then there's HTTP 2 on the horizon. Today we have to do sort of request, response for all these individual components of an application. HTTP 2 promises that it's going to be a bit more clever here. So an HTTP 2 enabled server is simply supposed to figure out, okay, this index.html has all these transitive dependencies, so let's just send them over the wire without a lot of requests. It'll be some time before that lands. The nice thing is that for once, people don't have to upgrade their browsers. It's just up to the server providers to upgrade their HTTP 2 here. So eventually we'll end up with sort of less boilerplate JavaScript with this, better interoperability, and the tools are able to do better introspection as well, because it doesn't have to sort of climb over all these boilerplate hacks in order to find the real code. And then we have web components with all of these things. Let's see if we have an example here. At this point, we're writing the templates like this with all these mustache-like curly braces, right? But a template is simply supposed to be a template element in the HTML. So at this point, we have to put them kind of not very nice into a script tag like this, and then declare it as, for example, a text Angular template. But that's supposed to be simply built into HTML. And well, it isn't parsed in the beginning. It won't pre-fetch your images, but it will actually wait. And there's less of a security hassle because it's simply inert HTML as long as you don't use it. And we don't have to mess around with a lot of strings, which is always a bad idea, basically. Let's see. So here's the shadow DOM, for example. In this case, we're declaring a container like this. And inside of that, we have another template like this. But in the case of shadow DOMs, the other divs are hidden here because they simply don't matter to the outside world, and we just declare the component that matters. Right. So a lot of standards that are coming along with HTML will simply better support the things we are trying to do in Angular already. So here we actually might see one of these components where a library or a framework that we've started to use gets easier over time as it adapts to the new HTML5 technologies. There we go. That's the 3 reasons.